Hi, and welcome to Fair Perspectives. I'm Wilfred Riley, Senior Fellow at FAIR and guest from episode 2, filling in today for Angel Eduardo. My co-host is melissachen, who you will hear from shortly. And today we'll be speaking with Konstantin Kisin. Some housekeeping. This will be the last episode of the first season of Fair Perspectives. Season 2 will be launching in the new year with a brand new format. You'll be seeing more of me then, and we look forward to announcing more details shortly. Now, Konstantin Kisin is a Russian-British comedian, podcaster, and social commentator. He made international headlines in 2018 by refusing to sign a quote-unquote university behavioral agreement which banned jokes about religion and atheism and insisted that all humor be respectful and kind. He is also the creator and host of the Triggernometry YouTube channel, where two comics interview economists, political experts, journalists, and social commentators about interesting, controversial, and challenging subjects. In this episode, we discuss Twitter under Elon Musk's leadership, why Sam Harris left the platform, why free speech absolutism is a trap, how the Western culture war affects views on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, Russia's own internal politics, Konstantin's book, An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West, redefining words for political purposes, wokeness and comedy, the debate surrounding gender ideology and trans issues, and why the UK seems better equipped to handle this than the United States. Ladies and gentlemen, I bring you Konstantin Kisin.
Konstantin Kisin, welcome to Fair Perspectives.
Thanks for having me, guys.
So one thing that I really love about you and the show is that I think it has become very difficult to thread the needle in modern discourse. It's really difficult to be anti-woke without being crazy, to discuss immigration in an honest way without being racist, or talking about COVID lockdowns without being, super radical about vax positions. And I think in the last couple of years, both you and Francis have built this platform, this podcast, Triggernometry, that kind of has captured a weird a zeitgeist that is kind of successful in threading this needle. You see it even with the Russia-Ukraine stuff. People who are so anti-war that they're pro-war, pro-tyranny. So it's really been a joy to see you guys grow and become successful. To that, I wanted to get into kind of a topic that's very close and dear to our hearts. It's current right now. It's what's happening with Twitter. It seems like there was a clip that went very viral. It was a concatenation of events. It started with this clip that you and Francis did an interview with Sam Harris that went super viral. And it led to this series of events that now, as of Thanksgiving 2022, Sam Harris has officially left Twitter, and everyone's talking about it like it was his funeral. But I wonder if you can weigh in a little bit on what are you thinking about the changes on Twitter, and a little bit on this, why Sam Harris left and how you feel about it.
Well, first of all, thank you for that extremely generous introduction. I don't know if I can claim that we've captured the zeitgeist exactly. There's a small niche of people who want to not go crazy in either direction. We're trying to speak to them as much as we can. How big that niche is, I'm not sure right now, because everybody seems pretty crazy at this point in time. But in terms of Twitter and Sam Harris, I like the changes at Twitter. I think a paid model where you pay to use it encourages different types of behavior from people, very, very different. And that's been our experience. We have a platform that we use for our supporters called Locals. And when people have to pay to be a member of a thing, and it's you treat it differently, and you speak to people differently, and you behave differently. So I like that. I think Elon's talked a lot about how he's going to release all the censorship backstory, and that I really want to see, because I'd like to see what's been going on for the last 8 years. Thank you very much. I mean, a lot of us have felt very strongly that there was some shenanigans going on there. I want to find out, because I'm pretty sure there's something to find out, and I'd like to see that, and then we can talk about which side does more to undermine democracy and all of that. And I don't make this as a partisan point. I just think there's been a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes that I don't like, and I really hope that Elon, releases a little bit of that in terms of how things work. And by the way, we know that all the big tech companies worked in concert on censoring COVID stuff, on censoring other stuff. So whatever is behind the scenes at Twitter is probably happening everywhere else as well. So from that perspective, I like what he's done. I like even more what he said he will do that he hasn't done yet. So let's see if that happens. And in terms of Sam Harris, he put out I think a thing on his podcast earlier this week in which he talked about, I think I actually haven't had a chance to listen to it, but what I've been told is basically, he thinks it's bad and he doesn't want to be there. Is that broadly accurate?
Yeah. He says that Twitter is a crack house, not a public square.
Right. Well, it sounds like I should listen to it because that sounds funny. But if his general point is that Twitter's not good, I think you've got to remember, this isn't to say he's right or wrong, frankly. It's just like we all have our own Twitter experience. Remember that. So I can see why Sam would see it in that way in the last few months, particularly, right? I think whether it is a bad place or a good place kind of depends on what's going on, right? Like, I love Twitter. I have a great time on Twitter. There's times when I have a less good time on Twitter because a lot of people are criticizing me. And when you have a big account, it's quite a lot of stuff to take in. It affects your experience. You know what I mean? So for someone like Sam, who has had to, take a lot of bullets in the last, since the summer, basically. And I hate to say it, since our interview, because it's not what I ever wanted to happen with him. He's had to deal with a lot. And so I think from his perspective, that's probably true. Do I personally, from where I'm sitting, agree with it? No, I don't think it's a bad place. I think it's got a lot of drawbacks, and social media in general has massive drawbacks. But of course, we wouldn't be having this conversation. You and I wouldn't have met in London a week ago and had a great. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's a networking thing for us too. It's the way we connect the world, and in some ways, we've seen with the war in Ukraine or China right now or Iran right now, we are a more connected world as a result of all of this social media, right? And we can click into what's going on in different places and care about them, even if it's futile, or maybe we can do something. You know what I mean? We can spread the word about things. So, I don't see it that way. I think when people have a bad personal experience with something, they always assume that whole thing is bad. Maybe, for Sam, maybe he'll come back. I hope he does. I do think, you talk about how people said, everyone talked like it was his funeral. I was one of those people, because I will miss Sam on Twitter. I liked reading his thoughts. He's one of the, in my sort of like last 6 years intellectually, he's one of the people he was there at the very beginning of the journey, and I haven't gone back much since, but he was there. And so I don't want to throw that in the bin. I don't know if Sam's going to say something fascinating 6 months from now, even though I currently disagree with him on a lot. So for me, it was sad. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things that I noticed with the Twitter conversation is that there seems to be almost a debate about the value of information. So I think a lot of people like Sam assume that the people that are coming back to Twitter are going to have really nothing of value to offer. You see a lot of these comments like, Elon Musk is letting his fellow little boys back on. These are white supremacists. There's a Jaron Taylor and Stefan Molyneux and so on down the line. And I think the reality is that if you allow anyone to talk freely who doesn't threaten people, you're going to see people like that. I mean, in my opinion, somewhat unfortunately. But I think what you said about the algorithms earlier, Elon Musk saying he has these codes and he's going to release what Twitter is doing, that's a very insightful point, and that's accurate, because the reality is that a lot of perfectly mainstream people were almost certainly painted as extreme, painted as radical, and essentially banned or shadow banned across that site. I mean, we saw these insane stories. I mean, you were one of the, in my opinion, the wittier commenters on some of this stuff, like the New York Post. I mean, America's third oldest newspaper or whatever couldn't speak on the platform for weeks. I guess just sort of as a very quick follow when it comes to Twitter and social space, and this might lead into some questions about, Kanye West and all these other things that are going on. But I mean, do you have any worries about kind of the future of speech in the broader social market as everyone returns? I mean, should everyone be allowed to talk? Do good ideas beat bad ones, or is there a huge downside risk to that? Which seems to be, I don't know how well the question's worded, but that seems to be Sam's whole thing, that this is all bad. My opinion is that we're going to see algorithmically that a huge number of perfectly normal people, including me and you from time to time, were painted as crazy radicals. But what do you think? Is the social space devalued now, or what's your take?
Look, I think at the risk of sounding like I'm not answering your question exactly, I think it's complicated. Mm-hmm. So first of all, let's set the context, right? Twitter. Do you know how extremely hard it is to moderate a platform with that many people and to do it consistent? Like a basketball referee can't get a game consistent, and you expect these guys, however many hundreds of them, they're, by the way, mostly in one country, so they don't understand culture. Am I allowed to swear on this podcast?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Or not? For sure.
Yes, go ahead. Go for it.
As you probably both know, in the UK, the word cunt is considered perfectly usable and normal. Oh, you cunt. Yeah. Oh, good to see you, cunt. That's how we talk. In America and in many other English-speaking countries, it is it's an extremely bad thing to say, and people will take it in a completely different way to the way it will be heard in the UK and Australia and New Zealand and a couple of other English-speaking places. So YouTube's enforcement rules, and I know this because we run triggernometry, right, say that word automatically means your entire video is demonetized, right? In the UK, we say that word all the time, but it's because it's an American company with American standards that we have these rules enforced on us by people somewhere else, right? So even within one language group, you can't moderate things fairly, right? And it's the same with behavior and the same with everything else. So there is no way in hell you're going to get entirely consistent moderation on something like Twitter, unless you have no moderation at all, right? However, does anyone really think that you can have no moderation at all? I don't think so. I think there will always be a limit. It's just about that's all we're ever arguing about is where does the Overton window end? How few people in the world really think there should be no window at all? Like anything goes. You can harass people. You can whatever, right? There's always going to be some restriction. And the question is about where it should be. I think Twitter's moving in the right direction by allowing more speech, because I don't think the Overton window has been wide enough. And I still don't think it's wide enough. It's not because I approve of the opinions of these people. I just think we should always err on the side of letting them speak. And by the way, I don't know if you caught the Tim Cast thing from a couple of days ago, right? Free speech kind of works, huh?
Well, with those clowns, yeah. But no, I mean, that's a key point, that for a long time on Twitter, the Overton window was set by people to the left of probably 95% of the general population. Right. I mean, when I look at you two, I don't really see radical, hard body, Pat Buchanan style conservatives when it comes to sexuality, women's rights, so on down the line. But the idea was that virtually anyone who didn't fit a certain very specific model, Matt Yglesias is being attacked today for being too far to the right, was sort of a dangerous rightist provocateur. And I mean, I think Elon Musk, who's maybe center right at most, it does have the idea of opening that up so that the limits again become fraud and child pornography and so on, as opposed to offending someone. So interesting.
Yeah, well, look, I think the fact is two centrists like me and Melissa being considered, out there or whatever is just, it just shows you what it was. But you're right. If you have an organization that's controlled by quite wacky or maybe really wacky people, and I don't mean that they're crazy. I just mean in terms of the political spectrum, they're out there, right? And every time anyone sort of goes, well, maybe we should move the Overton window just slightly towards the center, and they're like, Nazis are coming. Well, then you're going to have a bit of a problem, right? So I'm glad that we are now slightly dragging sort of the Overton window a little bit in both directions. Let people talk and let them discredit themselves, as we've seen. It works. It works. Doesn't mean that there is no limit at all. I mean, this Fuentes idiot, he's been banned from Gab. You know, you're saying something wrong if you've been banned from Gab. You know what I mean? So there's always going to be people who can't speak anywhere because of this type of restriction. We've always had it. Some, you know, in many European countries, you get put in prison for neo-Nazi type stuff. So there's going to be rules, but I think there's going to be a point where the majority of people agree this is kind of where it is. That's why I've never called myself a free speech absolutist, because I think it's a kind of it's a teenage dream rather than a practical reality.
Yeah, you're very smart to do that, because it's so easy to paint somebody in the corner the moment they claim that to be the case. Because even the most absolutist of all would agree that there are certain limits, especially just bring up child porn, for example. You certainly don't believe that something like that should exist on Twitter, and that is not an issue of free speech. So, you know, it's very easy
But
to
it's
trap
not even
someone
child porn. I mean, child porn is illegal, but you could say, why doesn't Elon Musk, who calls himself a free speech absolutist, let Alex Jones back on?
Correct. Which he drew the line. Yeah. Yeah.
Everyone's got their own limits.
We actually talked about that in a constitutional law class today in my kind of primary job, actually, that even the U.S. First Amendment, which people pretend to be very absolute about, has the giant exceptions. I mean, it's not just child porn. It's any quote unquote obscenity, if anyone wants to prosecute it, fraud and theft. I mean, as you get into that crypto sector, libel, slander, I mean, huge on social media. Clear and present danger, actually, I think the final one, without rambling on about this, that's where you get into Alex Jones, where you're openly saying things like major crises didn't happen, or this particular location, the Pizzagate thing, is a deadly threat to you. You might want to take care of that. Many people are going to ban that, and quite a lot of that crosses the line of legality. So free speech, it's like free market. It doesn't mean you can sell slaves. It doesn't mean absolutely anything. But the Overton not being set by 5 former sociology majors from Berkeley is likely a good thing for the vast majority of us. So
absolutely.
I would agree.
Well, for all of us, actually, it's good for those people too, because they get exposed to stuff. You know, people learn. Like I, you know, in 2015, I would have been I wouldn't have been a woke guy, but I kind of would have been you know, a typical comedian. If you'd seen me on stage, I'd be doing Trump jokes and whatever. People change their mind as they're exposed to information, some of them, right? And when you learn more about the world, you kind of go, well, some of the stuff I no longer thought makes any sense anymore. So even those 5% of people who are the Berkeley graduates, it's good for them to know the country isn't exactly where they are. And maybe, you know, 1 out of 1 million of them will change their mind, and that's good.
And then perhaps if you actually hear Jared Taylor talk and realize that he's crazy but not a complete idiot, and that's the extreme right, you no longer think that melissachen is the extreme right, and you get a better sense of the spectrum that exists. Perhaps.
Yeah. Well, I will always think Melissa's on the extreme right.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like looking at her, you know, it's the jewelry, the business suit, an evil lord sort of vibe.
Just so right wing.
I know, it's crazy. Well, I really like the point that you brought up, though, about setting the terms for the rest of the world, because that is, I think, Elon's big challenge moving forward. We are living in a time right now where there are, you know, it's interesting. The major conflicts that are going on, they're erupting in, you know, enemies, traditional enemies of the United States. It's Iran, it's China, and it's Russia. And so Twitter is dealing constantly with so much, you know, just footage and tweets coming out from these places, because there's nowhere else for them to go, because information and social media platforms and internet access in general are censored in these 3 countries. And the stuff coming out from China right now is just kind of mind-blowing. And Russia and Ukraine, which has been playing on for the last, I don't know, now what, 8, are we in the 9th month of this war? And knowing how to deal with something like that, I think, you know, you talked about the verification process, right? What does it mean for, you know, accounts that are trying to disseminate information of protests going on the ground in these countries, of a new rocket shell attack somewhere in Ukraine? What if citizen journalists cannot afford the $8 a month? I mean, you know, how do we deal with that kind of issue, right? Because at the end of the day, the media, as you said, is even more gate kept, right? Talk about the 5 sociology majors from Berkeley, the traditional media. And so Twitter is our chance to actually kind of challenge that Overton window. And so it's so important to actually make sure that from a global perspective, we're not limiting it as well, which is actually one of my biggest concerns with how Elon seems to be moving in this direction of blue check everything.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I think certainly in terms of the practical, I mean, that consideration is very important. I think there is that drawback, and it should always be looked into. But I also think, practical experience with the conflict in Ukraine, for example, I follow very, very closely, and I speak to family in both countries and in nearing countries, and and people who understand what's going on. But I also read Russian and Ukrainian Telegram channels. Like, I don't get any information about the conflict in Ukraine from Twitter at all. And usually, if I see something on Twitter, I think this. I don't trust it nearly as much as if I've seen it on a Russian and a Ukrainian Telegram channel. Right? Then you kind of go, well, both sides are saying it's true, and this is from the source. Is probably right. But the reason I bring this up is that what I do see is almost all of that content is being reposted on Twitter by like Western-facing Russians and Ukrainians. Do you see what I'm saying? Who write in English. So what's happening, and the information is getting out just through a few conduits who've made it their business to reproduce the information from its source. So I think this idea, and by the way, look, Ukraine is not that poor a country. Like, even a citizen journalist can afford $8 a month in Ukraine, especially if they're putting out a lot of information. They'll be asked to write articles. It's a process that will give them the credibility as a journalist and opportunities, etc. So it'll be a worthwhile investment that they can make, I think. So I think, there needs to be. That is the one downside of the verification thing that was always going to be there, which is, what do you do with people who should be anonymous? And it's not just journalists not paying $8, because I think the thing that he was saying was that it's payment verification, it's not identity verification, right? So someone could still be anonymous, but they just would have their card details confirmed. So I just think these things need working out. And whenever you disrupt something as complex as Twitter, you're going to get stuff like that. But the difference to me is, it's very clear to me that the person who now runs Twitter is intent on making it better. Right. I don't remember having that feeling in the past. You know what I mean?
I'm interested in kind of pivoting to Russia and Ukraine, because it seems I'm seeing you out there. Addressing a very anti-woke audience that you've cultivated, that we've all cultivated, actually. And a faction of them seems to be looking at this conflict through the lens of the culture war. I'm struggling to find to kind of figure out what is going on behind this kind of like on the right, almost, I wouldn't say support, but almost tacit support of Russia. In this conflict. What are your thoughts on that?
To a man with a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. And if you view the world through the culture war lens, then you will see the culture war everywhere. You will project it onto everything. And then Putin becomes the great Christian savior of Western civilization, or whatever these people are running around thinking. Look, the truth is that first of all, I know exactly what you mean, and you're not. I can see why it's true what you say, that we've cultivated an anti-woke audience, but I've never set out to cultivate any particular audience. If I'm honest, I've always just tried to say what I think, and there have been plenty of times when portions of our audience and my own audience in the past have gone, well, I don't agree with this, and I'm unsubscribing, and I'm not supporting you financially, and I'm leaving, and we've gone, well, that's great, because that means you're not enjoying the show anymore, and that's fine. And we'll find other people who are enjoying the show, right? This is what happens. You're not going to, if you're true to what you believe, you're not going to go through life agreeing with everybody, especially if you're in a kind of truth-seeking business, as I hope we all are, right? Like when we bring a guest on Triggernometry, I want to find out the truth. I don't want to I don't want to please my audience, because I believe that our audience are people who are interested in the truth. And if you're not interested in the truth, well, maybe you're not our audience, and that's fine. That's okay. That's absolutely fine.
I subscribe. I really subscribe for the Russian accent that you do. That's actually why I'm a listener.
No, I wasn't trying to chase you personally away. I'm just saying I respect people's right not to enjoy the show. So I've not tried to cultivate that audience. But the answer to the short answer to your question is, if you have this thing on the left, which you absolutely do, which is I support the current thing. And if CNN and MSNBC said I have to care about this passionately, then I will, and believe this without question. There are people who do that. That's absolutely true. And likewise, you have the exact same thing on the right, which is I oppose the current thing. If CNN and MSNBC are saying something is true, it must be false.
Sorry to all bust in, but that's an interesting point that's worth repeating, that a great deal of right-wing pop culture, when you look at stuff like growing opposition to vaccines right now, is just opposition to the current thing. I've heard people say that online, but that's really well summarized. In fact, yeah, that describes kind of a lot of it. That if something goes on, I mean, the reaction to Blue Lives Matter versus Black Lives Matter and so on, a great deal of this is just well marketed, often better marketed, because many on the right are in the business world, backlash to whatever left-wing media is promoting at the time. And that's inherently kind of problematic, isn't it? I mean, you're not going to grow a self-sustaining cultural movement out of that. That's where the idea of reactionary almost comes into play and becomes negative. You're just playing on the other side's territory and kind of dancing with them. So what is right? What is sane kind of center right to right self-definition look like? Is probably a question worth asking for a lot of people, especially in my opinion, a lot of young men in all of our audiences. You don't see a whole lot of that.
I'm so glad you made that point, because one of the things I've been doing for the last couple of months is talking to friends of ours, people that are in this space, and kind of going, like, getting a dinner together. Winston Marshall and I, do that every now and again. And just going, guys, like, okay, we know what we're against, those of us who are not woke, but also not insane anti-woke people. We just want to be sensible. We don't believe in these extremes. Okay, we know what we're against. We know. What are we for? What do we believe? What is important? What do we actually think is the thing that we're offering the world? What is our view of the world going to offer people that they will go, oh yeah, I want some of that, right? Or is all you're offering is, oh, those guys over there are idiots? Well, they are, and those guys over there are idiots too. And so how do we find that space in the middle? So I've been thinking about that a lot. But I agree with you completely about what you say. And it is my firm belief that if Donald Trump had been reelected in 2020 and Vladimir Putin had invaded in February, as he did, which, by the way, I think probably wouldn't have happened, but never mind. If he had been reelected and he was still in office when this happened, and he chose to support Ukraine in the way that Joe Biden has, I guarantee you then almost the entirety of the people who currently oppose supporting Ukraine would oppose it, and vice versa. That's what would happen. And so the Democrats would currently be going, oh, no, we can't fund, whatever Nazis or whatever in Ukraine or whatever these people are coming up with, and scrutinizing the way that Lend-Lease was executed and asking all the difficult questions about biolabs in Ukraine, right?
No, I mean,
the Republicans will be going, there are no biolabs in Ukraine, there are no Nazis, and we need to give them more Patriot weapons or whatever it is. That's what will be happening.
No, I mean, I've done some of the professional survey data on this without false modesty, and this is just obviously correct. It's the same with any of this stuff. I mean, Trump and Biden ran a very close race because both were terrible candidates, cough. But I mean, when you look at the same thing with vaccines, for example, I mean, Trump was very pro-vaccine. In fact, Operation Warp Speed, Trump did a pretty good job of getting the Western vax out there. He actually should get some credit for that. But I guarantee you, if, the big guy had been up there on the podium talking in sort of patriotic Ronald Reagan terms, it's your duty to get 2 shots. What are you, a punk? Wear your mask around old ladies. It would be absolutely every right-wing guy would have 2 masks on their face, camo print, and there'd be incredible criticism of like the unwashed feminist skaters that refuse to mask up. You'd see the exact same thing 100% flipped. You see that all the time in partisan politics.
Right.
Like, why don't blacks vote Republican? There are many, many examples like this.
Just because people are tribal and they want to be in their tribe, and they'd rather be in the tribe than not, than be consistent with what they believe. They're happy to mold to whatever the tribe is going for. I understand that. It's an understandable instinct. I don't personally share it, but there are a lot of people who think in that way, and so I almost kind of like, I think when the invasion first happened, and I was quite emotional about it because, as people know, I have family in both countries, and I worry for all of them, in Russia, in Ukraine, everybody. I was quite emotional. I found it difficult to see people going off these deep ends as I saw it. But now I've sort of got to a point where I'm like, I don't even blame you. You don't know anything about this country. You've never been to Ukraine. You don't speak Russian or Ukrainian. You haven't read a piece of news in one of the two original languages ever. You went on Twitter, you saw your favorite 3 culture war commentators going, this is the truth about Ukraine. And that's what you went for. And then you saw a video of a guy you kind of saw, slightly respect from somewhere, who was once right about woke idiots. And before you know it, you're like, oh, well, this is what's happening in Ukraine, right? And I get it. I genuinely get it. There are countries about which I am certain I have the same opinion. Like, I don't have the first idea of what's happening in Latin America. And if someone that I respect had told me, well, this is what's happening, and then I saw a video somewhere, do you see what I'm saying? I'd probably have that opinion as well. Now, the difference between me and these people is my opinion would be very weakly held. I would say, I don't have any idea what's happening in Ukraine, but I did hear that somebody once said that blah, blah, blah. Is that true? Right? But we don't live in that world. In the world that we live in now, it's like, well, I once heard this thing, therefore that's the truth, and I'm gonna fight for that truth until my last breath. It's kind of where we've got to. I try not to have too strongly held opinions about things I don't know a lot about, but a lot of people don't.
This lack of principle thing really bothers me too. I always said that if Trump was a Democrat, he would have won the Nobel Peace Prize for the Abraham Accords. It's pretty clear to me that has changed and recalibrated a lot of things in the Middle East, and that was one of his signature foreign policy moves that really made a huge impact. But we can't recognize anything good that Trump did because he's just toxic. And if a Democrat had done that, I mean, Obama won a Nobel Prize for what exactly? I don't know. So, it's just.
I mean, there's a politically incorrect answer to that question, but let's not go there.
Right. So diversity, I don't know. Well, I think he won for being not Bush. That was it, because we had just come out 8 years war on terror. He just won because he opposed the Iraq War, probably.
Yeah, but come on, Melissa. There's another factor to it, which is we were all inspired by him, right? Here's this handsome, charismatic, young black guy who's going to come out and heal America. That was part of the sales pitch. That's what he got the Peace Prize for.
The interesting thing about this, just from an amoral political science perspective, is that Obama kept doing almost all of the same shit Bush was doing. And this is something that when you guys talk about tribal perspective versus reality, just sort of gets ignored. I mean, Obama jokingly called himself the deporter in chief and said he shipped more illegal immigrants out of the country than anyone ever before. And everyone just sort of kind of smiled and ignored it and patted him on the back and said, well, he looks great in that tan suit. So it's the ultimate example of tribalism. Like, your guy can't be doing that. Your guy can't be building concentration camps for little kids, so it didn't happen. And this, as
Obama is also like the left always has the they're nice people thing as well, right? Like the right, they're like pragmatic and they're doing the right thing, but they're kind of like doing it in an immoral way. That's kind of like the angle, right? Whereas the left, they may be fucking things up a lot, but they really were trying and they were doing their best. And real communism hasn't been tried and all that, right? Like but the intention is good, whereas the right is always assumed to have bad intention. Right, so Obama had that benefit, and also he was incredibly charismatic and eloquent, and people like charismatic and eloquent people, and they don't like people like George Bush who can't talk straight and whatever, and who sound dumb. I'm pretty sure George Bush was not dumb. I mean, he was president of the United States. Like, you got to have some intelligence to do that, but we all thought he was dumb because he sounds dumb, right? And not we all. I mean, the vast majority of people, or many people, But Obama sounded really, really inspirational and charismatic and eloquent and clever, and we go for that. It's a the job of politics is partly about sales, and he's a great salesman.
Well, and moving forward, Biden has continued a lot of Trump policies as well, especially on foreign policy. There's not a single, tariff that Biden actually rolled back when it comes to, the tariffs imposed on China, which all this America First stuff. Biden is not only doubling down; he's actually doubling down on it. He's added new things and which kind of undercuts this whole Beijing Biden narrative that the right was saying. So I think the way out of this, and that's just my opinion, is, we need to stop. I mean, it's very easy to just like fall into tribalism when the other side is also doing it. There's no incentive for anybody to just come out and say, you know what, yeah, this is not right. Like to criticize their own side. There really isn't. And as you said, social media actually incentivizes not doing that generally. You don't really have an audience. But again, I don't know if that's true, because you guys have cultivated your audience and it has grown, and you are using truth as or truth seeking as a North Star, and not a certain ideology, which is so refreshing in the day of, in how our media has really evolved, especially in the last 2 years. I mean, I just saw Justin Trudeau coming out saying, "Oh, we need to support all these protesters in China. They're supporting, they're out there protesting all these draconian lockdowns, and we should support the Chinese protesters." And it's just like, did everyone just memory hold this? That is just astounding to me.
Totally. No, there's not a lot of consistency in Trudeau. I mean, I'm surprised he didn't send help to the Chinese government. But yeah, we've got to a point, I think, where I think enough people are starting to be fed up of the obviously partisan stuff in both directions, that they're, again, the ones that were always asking questions, they're now starting to ask questions of the respective sides and going, well, who's maybe taking a look at both sides. I think it's every action has an equal and opposite reaction, and that's what we try to do. I think that's why we do these calls with our supporters, and we had this lady who joined us a couple of hours ago, and she just said, "You know what? I've been an independent voter for like 25 years." And, maybe I think there's going to be more independent voters going forward, because this tribalism is going to, people are tribal, but there's a big enough tribe of non-tribal people that I want to speak to. They're the ones that interest me.
If I could jump in quickly with one question about Ukraine. You mentioned this in passing, like you have relatives in Russia and Ukraine. This might sound almost naive, but what would you describe the situation in the conflict as being at the basic level of what's going on right now? I mean, one of the most consistent things I hear is I don't trust any news from Russia or Ukraine that I hear in the Western media. I mean, from many of the people I know who are grad students, for example, who work in the arts, the videos of Russian and Ukrainian atrocities, for example, seem, certainly on the Russian side, pretty obviously filmed. I mean, it seems like complete BS almost all the time. What's your take? I mean, is Putin as bad an actor as he's being painted? Does Ukraine have a fighting chance? What's going on from someone from the region?
Okay, so we should probably talk about the things that like everybody would agree on first, and then we can talk about who believes what, right? What everybody can agree on is the fact, which is that Russia invaded in February and attempted to cut Ukraine in half by invading from the north, from the south, and also simultaneously pushing from the east to lock up the Ukrainian forces in that area, right? And when that happened, they made progress in the south simply because they had traitors on the Ukrainian side who helped them take over Kherson, which is the city that Ukraine recently liberated in the south. So they made a big push there. They took the south, Mariupol, etc. In the north, they pushed right towards the capital, Kiev, but within a short order of time, they had to withdraw completely, right? So they were pushed out of that area. The same later happened in the northeast, and in the east, they've continued to make slow, very, very costly advances, costly for both sides. So they are able to push Ukraine very slowly westward, while both sides take huge casualties. So it's a complete meat grinder there. And then most recently, the Ukrainians retook the south because when the Russians initially captured Kherson, they pushed beyond the river and ended up being essentially cut off on one bank of the river without access to their support, logistics, etc. So they eventually found the situation untenable and pulled back. So it's a stalemate-ish probably for next month or so because of winter and things like that. And then it's in the balance, so to speak. I think from an obvious, it obviously all depends on how much support the West is prepared to give Ukraine, because they've shown themselves to be very, very keen to fight and win. But then it's about, do they have the economic and military support to make it happen? Because on their own, they would have been the entire country would have folded within a week. Not within a week, but within a few months, you could say. Maybe not within a week, within a few months. So it all depends. But right now, the Ukrainians have retaken a lot of territory. The Russians are increasingly. I definitely would not use the word mutinous, but there is a lot of talk in sort of Russian commentator circles that went from, we're going to win and everything's going to be amazing and we're going to take over, blah, 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 to like, who's responsible for what's happening right now? Who's the guilty person? Because in Russia, this is how, whenever anything goes wrong, it's about who can be made responsible for it. So, and of course, you must never criticize the president, so someone else must be responsible. So they're trying to find different people who are responsible. They keep firing generals and moving them around and stuff like that. So it's definitely not currently being seen in Russia as a success by people who understand what's going on. I mean, the ordinary public are watching TV and being told everything's hunky-dory. So it's just I think Ukraine have done way better than anyone really expected, me included. But it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to win or lose or whatever. It's completely in the balance and nobody really knows how it's going to end.
Do you have a sense of what the anti-Putin sentiment is? Or if at all? Has it grown? Like, has it grown in Russia? Yeah.
I think it probably has grown a little bit, but if I'm correct in understanding your question, you're sort of going like, how soon are the Russian people going to rise up and overthrow Putin? Not very soon. I think it's
why is that?
Not soon. Yeah, more like never, really, because that's not what we do in Russia.
Okay, so it's very similar to China, because the same questions are being asked right now about what's going on, and I'm like, sorry, I don't think change is coming.
No.
In China, it's a bit different. I do, I think the resentment is actually against specific policies, which is much better, which is much easier to achieve than freedom and democracy, these kind of more abstract concepts. Right. And perhaps the government actually be a bit more responsive to these limited policies.
To add to that, in Russia, there's also a cultural dimension to it, which is the most important thing in Russian politics is to have a strong leader. And this is a product of centuries of events that taught Russians that basically anytime you have a weak leader, bad things happen. There's a period in Russian history called Times of Trouble, which is the end of the Rurikid dynasty, where Ivan the Terrible, and by the way, this is to reinforce that point. Do you know that Ivan the Terrible isn't called Ivan the Terrible in Russian?
Ivan the Great or something?
He's called Ivan the Fearsome, because to be feared is good, even if you're terrible. So if you've got someone who's fearsome and terrible, you go, well, at least he's fearsome, right? Whereas in many other parts of the world, you go, well, he's terrible, let's get rid of him, right? And what Russians learned is when you don't have a strong leader, as you didn't have in times of trouble and several other times, bad things happen, famines happen, the wars happen, you get invaded, people die, etc. And so there's this historical wound almost in Russian mythology, which is like, you better make sure you have a strong leader and you back him to the hilt. Now, the good thing about that is when the leader dies, as long as, it's seen to be legitimate, it was a natural death or whatever, The country can flip overnight. I mean, Joseph Stalin dies in 1953. Khrushchev comes in and goes, that really wasn't the good stuff. We that's not the communism that we were trying to build, and everybody moves on all of a sudden, right? So these things can flip very, very quickly when the leadership changes. Now, are people going to overthrow Vladimir Putin? No. Is there going to be a palace coup? I can't imagine one. But if the time comes and the three of us are still alive when he goes one way or another, then you get there is the potential for the country to go in a completely different direction, completely different. Is that likely though? I don't think so, because Russian culture doesn't change, and if you value stability and strength above all, well, why would you need democracy? Democracy is kind of like a rich people's game.
Well, so I grew up in a place where we also had a very strong kind of heavy-handed kind of government, and the leader of Singapore, the founder of Singapore, Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, actually said this. I'm going to read you the quote, and I grew up knowing this. Now, if democracy will not work for the Russians, a white Christian people, can we assume that it will naturally work with Asians?
What a racist.
Yeah, that is a direct quote. That is a direct quote by Lee Kuan Yew. Was in his book, and that is what he thought about sort of like cultural determinism.
But this is the thing that
there's a weird kind of Western arrogance that these sort of powerful, equal rival societies, Russia, who we've sparred with for 100 years, that they're all of a sudden going to change their behavior. We saw this when we were fighting the Arabs during the Iraq War. The idea was what they really need is Western democracy accompanied by conversions to our capitalist model and Christian missionaries entering the country. And it seemed at root like a nonsensical idea, like this may well not work in Iraq. And in fact, you saw the Sunni Shia fighting and so on. I mean, immediately this began. So it's the same thing. I mean, Konstantin, hearing you say this, that had been my suspicion, that there was a 0% chance that a Russian strongman who's doing a pretty competent job was going to be removed from power for scoring a tie in a war. But it was one of those, I don't know, really kind of things. But the same thing in China. I mean, Xi is not going anywhere. I mean, what you're seeing, actually, I can read Chinese at a cute, first grade level. And I mean, the tweets on Chinese Twitter today are basically indicating they're going to open the country. Like one of them earlier today said, you only have to go to the COVID center if you want to. That's my half-assed translation. But I mean, what they're saying is the biggest, most hated portion of this, you go to this sort of camp for 2 weeks, is ending. And in a couple of days, they're going to start unlatching the buildings and so on. And that's going to be the response to the protests and the very limited rioting. It's not going to be the Communist Party steps down. They're intervening steps you can take before becoming Americans.
Right. Completely.
Unfortunately.
And it's almost like cultures are different, Will and Melissa, right? It's almost like not everyone in the world thinks like us. And you're right, it's Western arrogance, because you see this now with the World Cup in Qatar.
I was going to say that.
And look, the obvious disclaimer, yes, I condemn the way that Qatar treats gay people and women and migrant workers. Of course I do. I do. I think it's terrible. I don't agree with it. But is it fair of us to give them the World Cup, right? Didn't have to happen. It was given to them by FIFA. You give them the World Cup, and then you come to their country and you go, oh, this is wrong. We don't like this, and your laws and this are complete. Well, I mean, I don't know that it is, even though I think those things are very, very wrong and bad and wrong and bad,
bad and wrong.
And bad and wrong. But, different cultures have different values, and you can't, I don't think the West's job is to go around to every other country in the world and tell them how to live their lives. Like, we don't want people to tell us how to live our lives, right? Why should people in other countries do the same? And Russia has its own culture. And I'm afraid in Russian culture, they're going to stick with whoever the top dog is until he stops being top dog. But then there's an opportunity for change. The problem is it's a kind of self-correcting mechanism in Russia, because why has Putin cracked down? Why has he become more authoritarian over time? Why did he invade Ukraine in 2014 and now again? And why did he want the Sochi Olympics so much and all of that? Because as a country gets richer, and more stable. And by the way, as a fierce critic of Putin's, I will give him this. Under his watch, I'm not saying because of his actions, but under his watch, the country became much more stable and much more prosperous. And I actually, in fact, I take back what I said. It was thanks in many ways to his policies. Now, you may disagree with his policies in some ways, but they did achieve stability. They ended the war in Chechnya, and they dealt with the terrorism problem in Russia over time, and which was hugely significant. And the country became more prosperous and stable in every other way during this time, right? So what happens when you get to that point? Well, suddenly people go, oh, okay, well, we've got stability, we've got safety, we've got economic prosperity, I'm making more money. Well, maybe we should start thinking about, change, democracy or doing things a bit differently. People start to ask questions, why do we need the strongman leader if we're prosperous, stable and comfortable and there are no terrorists, right? When we had terrorism, we needed a strongman leader, right? But do we still need to have him? Well, maybe not. People start asking questions, right? And that's the point at which you go, we have external enemies, guys. Look at these evil Ukrainians. Look at what they're doing. The evil Americans have they're encloaking Russia in their aggressive mentality or whatever it is. The generation of foreign threats and internal crackdowns are a product of the fact that Vladimir Putin came to power at a time when the three of us were worried about the millennium bug, right? He's been in power since basically 2000. So there is going to be natural kind of diminishing of his position unless he takes steps to reinforce it. And the war in Ukraine and taking Crimea were huge boosts to his popularity. Taking Crimea in 2014 basically made him invulnerable in Russian politics, right? There was no questioning him after that. Like, this is a guy who's taken back Russian territory. This is how Russia works. Sorry.
And this is very analogous to what I worry about with China wanting to take over Taiwan as well. I mean, it's baked into when you're being educated, for all the way from kindergarten to university in China. This is drilled into you about Taiwan being rightfully China's, and the people are very supportive of that. And when you at the end of the day, strongman governments are always paranoid about their legitimacy. That's also why they try so hard, as you say, to participate in these like global events like the G20, like the UN meetings and things like that, or hosting the Olympics, because participation in the global community gives strongmen legitimacy. And which is, whether or not we should allow that is a side conversation. But this drive to take back Taiwan is another way to shore it up when your legitimacy is slowly eroding back home or is being questioned because of, policies that are really own goals. They're self-owns in the case of C. So this is a very common tactic that authoritarians use around the world. All right, let's pivot to your book. I wanted to commend you for writing it. I love the title alone. It's a bit provocative. It's a title where you're just like, okay, wow, this is something that you don't really hear very often.
Did you say my book title is provocative?
Yeah, a little.
Writing a book called An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West is provocative.
In a way, because the West is just viewed today with so much self-loathing from people in the West and outside the West. Also, well, that's just loathing. That's not self. But in that, I know who you wrote it for. Unfortunately, I don't think the people who you wrote it for are likely to read something like that. But I don't know about
that. One woman did, Melissa. I got a message on Twitter from a woman who read a thing that I translated, a Putin speech, and she messaged me saying, "Oh my God, thank you for doing this. Oh my God, I can't wait to read your book, and I'm going to buy it now." And she sent me 5 messages about how she's buying the book, and now she's bought the book, and now the book's been delivered. And then she read it and basically started hate spamming me every day for the next week, telling me how much of an idiot I am. So some of them are likely to read it, Melissa. The outcome, though, questionable.
Well, the reason I say it's controversial is because, in a way, it's a defense of the West. And anyone trying to defend Western values and Western civilization right now is, as you you guys were discussing earlier is painted as far right. That includes people like Douglas Murray and really all of us. You know, if you're taking a pro-civilization view, today in mainstream Western discourse is kind of controversial. It shouldn't be. I think that's the tragedy of this of this, but it is. And so I'm grateful that you wrote the book. And you know, I'm just trying to. I'd like to go into it a little bit about the book. One part which I found really interesting was you mentioned this kind of the way language is being co-opted here in the West to kind of usher in this kind of radical new agenda that undercuts Western civilization. Can you go into that a little bit?
Yeah, well, first of all, setting the context a little bit, I'm sure you two know where political correctness comes from, but most people don't, and it comes from the Soviet Union. It was invented to be able to prevent people from speaking the truth because it was politically inconvenient. It never had anything to do with not offending people, being, respectful of others, not mistreating minorities. That's not what political correctness ever had anything to do with. It was always about, you can't say this because it is inconvenient. Even though it may be factually correct, it is politically incorrect, right? But the thing that you're talking about is an even more sleight of hand. And of course, it's partly a natural process, but partly not, because language is now enforced through institutions and all sorts of other things. But if you change the meaning of a word, you change the law without changing the law. So if you change the meaning of safety from meaning the absence of physical violence to my feelings won't hurt, then you change the law which governs how people should provide safety or ensure safety or whatever. So you're going to get to a point where a law that once said, well, people shouldn't be able to be physically assaulted, this law now says people shouldn't be able to speak their mind. It's a very natural, obvious progression if you allow the meanings of these words to gradually evolve over time. I'm not saying it changes overnight, because it can't, right? But there's just this creep of what the word means. And if you get to a point where the word safety means that no one disagrees with you, well, that law might get enforced. And we have this in the UK. We have a law on the books which says that it is against the law to be grossly offensive, and people are arrested for posting memes on Facebook. Right? That's how it works.
So I actually have kind of a technical legal question about that out of sheer curiosity. I trained as a lawyer in the States before my current job. You read these headlines from the UK and Germany, like one on Social Today, 90 arrested in house-to-house raids for social media offense. That was in, I think, Stuttgart, Germany. But in the UK, how does that work? I mean, so if your IP address, I guess if you're not using Tor, or your Twitter account is linked to an offensive meme, they'll send armed policemen to get you and you'll be charged with a crime. Is that something that happens with any regularity?
Well, the 90 people stormed by police, we haven't had anything remotely like that in the UK. So that I don't know. And I don't know anything about Germany either, whether that's happened or not. But in the UK, we have routinely people arrested for posting an offensive Facebook post or tweet, or you're probably familiar with the Count Dankula story.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Yeah, right. So the Count Dankula, I know him, and he's not a racist guy. He's just an internet kind of trolley personality, and when the newspapers write about him, they're legally allowed to call him a Nazi hate criminal because he did a video, right? So it's not just about the money that he was fined. It's about, this is your reputation now. You are now a Nazi hate criminal, a convicted or whatever it was, a convicted whatever. It's not a good thing, and it happens regularly. Now, every time it happens, the police eventually come out and are like, well, this was a bit of a mistake. Most of the time. Count Dankula was unique in that he was actually convicted. And there are some other people who've been convicted. But generally, they're like, well, this was a mistake. But of course, if people didn't come out and didn't protest against it, they wouldn't consider it a mistake. Because they only say it's a mistake when there's a backlash.
Yeah, and
right.
just to follow up on this one, because I'd wondered about this too. You see this on Twitter or Facebook, something like that. Yeah, this is a real story. Washington Examiner and Washington Post, a short piece. Germany raids homes over hate speech and insults on social media. You got a couple articles, September 27, 2022 and November 3rd, 2022. Hundreds of homes, about 200, were raided. Electronic devices have been confiscated, and more than 1,000 Germans have been charged since it looks like 2018 for posting offensive social media content. Adam Santoriano, anyway, blah, blah, blah. But Adam Santoriano of the New York Times is preparing what's going to probably be the long form piece on this. But yeah, they've decided to crack down on online talk. They've had enough. So they're apparently arresting both kind of German right-wing lads and Arab immigrants for talking shit to each other on the internet, basically. So it's door to door. They've got guys out there in body armor knocking down doors and arresting these internet guys. Yeah. I've been curious about that.
Well, when it comes to the secret police, the Germans have had a lot of practice. You know what I mean? Like they know how to execute a good plan.
Oh no! Wow.
Germans know how to build things. I mean, roads, trains. Yeah, it's a long history.
Sorry, Melissa, was that too far? No. As a Jew, I'm allowed to make that joke.
That's true. That's true. I mean, I understand Germany's sensitivity to this, but they are going down such a dark path, and yeah, I'm not familiar with German law, but I do know that they have one of the most stringent, laws when it comes to censoring Holocaust denial, which, like a Kanye West would not be able to say what he's been saying in Germany. He would actually be in jail for all the crap he's been saying recently. And anywhere that actually inherited the British Penal Code, Singapore included, we have the same law. So I've always grown up knowing that if I say anything that my neighbor feels offended by, he can file a police report, and that does happen. And the police will come pay me a visit. That's just how it works. You're right. There are difficulties in tracking people down on message boards and things like that. But when you have a government that can basically subpoena a company to reveal the IP address of a person, that's not hard to find the individual. But most of the time, it actually takes your fellow citizens to report you. Once a police report is filed, the police are obligated to actually come in and look into things. And that's when you see these kind of like really funny tweets, like the Metro Police or something is investigating some joke posted on Twitter or posted on Facebook. And, this idea of like the police not dealing with actual crimes and like instead going to a house to interrogate somebody about, I don't know, a joke about two genders or something, which actually is happening in the UK, is actually pretty, it's funny, but it's shocking.
Yeah. Well, it's shocking to you guys. Most people in this country don't care. They don't pay attention to this. It doesn't particularly bother them because you guys have a First Amendment and a culture of you can have a First Amendment and still not have free speech, but America has a culture of that, right? And the culture is, look, I may very strongly disagree with things and I may be offended by them, but you're allowed to say them. And I will defend your right to say the things that I hate you saying. That for the most part, that's what America and Americans are for and what they believe. In the UK, we don't have that. And so we are a society where this happens. And I'm actually reassured by how shocked you guys are, Barry, because it kind of reminds me that some of us are still sane.
Well, and all of this has a huge impact on comedy, right? Which is a profession that you left. Have you left comedy or? Yeah.
Well, I'm on a break for as long as it lasts, and if I always say if it's the rest of my life, I'm really happy with that. It's fine. But you never know. I might just suddenly decide I want to do that again. The main reason I stopped was just it was a very hard lifestyle, and doing trigonometry became a full-time job, and I can't have two jobs. And of the jobs I want to do well, I want to do trigonometry well. So I've been focusing on that. So I actually don't know. Maybe Melissa, we're all exaggerating. Maybe in the 2 years since lockdown, I haven't done comedy. There's been an explosion of free speech on the British comedy circuit, and you've got all sorts of comedians pushing all sorts of boundaries and making incredibly cutting edge material and really entertaining audiences with something new and different. I'm sure that's happening, but I haven't seen it.
Well, I mean, I will say myself and Jane watched some of the British and Canadian comedy specials for a date night about a week ago, and they were all pretty much what you'd have seen a year or two ago. One was called Is It a Bird? And was a trans female comedian talking about their issues in the industry. And that was pretty typical. So I don't know. I don't know if the Renaissance has come yet.
Well, yeah, I call you a skeptic on this one, Will. I'm sure it's happening. People keep telling me I was wrong about free speech in comedy in 2015 and 2016 and 2017, and especially 2018 and 2019 when I was talking about it. So maybe they've transformed the comedy scene now that I'm not on it and made it incredibly cutting edge and brilliant and innovative. I'm sure that's happening. I'm really certain.
Moment you left, that's when it began.
Yeah, I mean, well, this is what people tell me. There's no problem. This is what people tell me. There's no problem with free speech and British comedy, and I'm sure they're right. But I will say this: when we went to America, I really got the sense very strongly that isn't the case in America nearly in the same way. And I think that's partly because America's a bigger place. And so, Joe Rogan can go and set up his club in Austin and we went to that club, like, let's just say, I wonder if some comedians might have been arrested if they'd done some of those jokes in the UK, genuinely. I'm not joking. So there's freedom there. And, people don't feel as restricted, which is great. It's great for comedy to have that opportunity. In the UK, I'm not saying it's still like that because I'm sure it's transformed, as I keep saying. But when I was doing it, it was a very small industry. Yes, exactly. We must cross ourselves. It was a very small industry, very kind of one opinionated and very opinionated at the same time, having one opinion, but having it very strongly, leaning very much in one direction, thinking that, a big important part of how you pick people to promote, etc., is to do with their sex and their sexuality and their skin color. And so since then, we've seen lots of comedy shows actually shut down in the UK because people stopped watching them. They were the biggest shows that people used to watch: Mock the Week, The MASH Report, which I actually wrote on for a bit. And I'm Told Live at the Apollo, which is the biggest one, is next. So that's what was happening when I was there. But I wouldn't want to comment on the industry I'm no longer in.
Okay. Actually, one or two, I guess, quick questions. One of them that Mel and I talked about before the show, but a kind of an offshoot of the general free speech idea. When you talk about the redefinition of words changing laws, that's actually something we've seen in both the US and the UK. So, I mean, in all seriousness, from a legal standpoint, people will now say that, for example, the definition of racism is any system that produces differences in performance between groups. So if whites or Jewish Americans of all colors outperform blacks who outperform Hispanics on a standardized test, the test is racist and you have to get rid of it. But probably the ultimate example of this is the attempt to change sort of very core human terms like man and woman when you get into the trans and non-binary issue. And you and Francis Foster are known for talking a lot about this kind of trans and trans rights issues and so on. This is condensing a complex issue into one sentence, but what's your take on that? And also, why does there seem to be a backlash now in Britain where there's a big move back from the, misgendering me as a crime to things that no one would have expected 2 years ago, I'm guessing, like the Tavistock Gender Clinic shut down amidst what seemed to me like a series of excuses, like someday we might open up smaller local versions, but their lawsuits are being prepped by 43 mothers or whatever it is. What's your take on this, and why is Britain taking such a huge step back?
Well, that's a really good question, actually. First of all, I will just say that I don't think Francis and I are known for talking about it, but I hope we're known for giving people who have strong views about that issue an opportunity to speak. That's our angle on it. I'm not someone who's going around campaigning on this stuff, but I do think it's important. And so if someone wants to come and talk about it and they're sensible and reasonable, then we'll happily have them on. That's kind of my angle on it. And the reason I feel strongly about it is because I care. I mean, again, you can come at it in different angles, but first and foremost, I care about the truth. I care about what's true. And a man who chops off his genitals does not become a woman. I mean, that's a fact. And if people want to disagree with that, they can. But we used to get taught that in biology, and I hope we still teach that in biology. Maybe we don't. I don't know. So for number one, I'm interested in truth. Number two, I think that the risk of this becoming an ideology, which it has done to some extent, and being something that young, vulnerable, autistic children or gay children are exposed to, I think is a crime. I think the fact that there may be dozens of children who've, and we know that there are, I mean, we see them all the time, the detransitioners, right? Dozens of people who transitioned physiologically, who changed their bodies permanently, who made themselves infertile, and so on and so forth, massively reduced their life expectancy, exposed themselves to serious risk of serious complications. All of that happened because some adults wanted to feel that they're progressive. I've got a problem with that. Sorry. Yeah, if that makes me a bigot, I guess I am a bigot. And the third thing, of course, is there are contexts, and I don't think it's nearly as often as people like to make out. I don't think trans women are breaking into female bathrooms every moment, and that's all they wake up. They wake up every day and they go to a female bathroom to try and, oppress some women. And I don't think that's what happens. But there are contexts like that situation, and like a female prison, and like other sports where there is a serious and obvious either threat or unfairness that women are exposed to as a result of this becoming as a result of people attempting to normalize the mantra that, if you say you're a woman, you're a woman. Well, I have every bit of compassion for trans people. I don't want to see them mistreated or discriminated against or mocked or anything else. I think their lives are hard enough. But that doesn't mean that I'm going to say things that are untrue or agree with exposing children or women to danger or unfairness. I think that's wrong. And so that's why we talk a lot about it. Why are we making progress in the UK in dealing with this? Mm-hmm. I genuinely don't know, actually. It's very strange because the country that doesn't have the free speech that we were talking about only moments ago, I actually think one of the reasons is that we don't have privatized medicine like you guys do. I think no one gets to make money from this in a way that would personally affect their income. You know what I mean? Like, there isn't a company out there selling loads of drugs that has influence on how things work, that has influence in that way. It's just the whole system doesn't work that way. You basically can't profit by pushing something like this because we have a public healthcare system, right? So I think one of the reasons that it's continuing in America is that people are making money off it, right? It's not just ideology; it's also profitable, right? In the UK, we don't have that issue because it's a public healthcare system. So I think most people, even in those situations, they wouldn't have been operating on that basis. They would have been going, we must have compassion for these vulnerable children, and they say they're trans, and I've been taught all this gender ideology woo-woo. I can help save this young person's life who otherwise will commit suicide. Like, that would have been their motivation. Whereas in America, I'm certain there are people who are not thinking that at all. They're thinking, well, these kids want this, and my job in the free marketplace of goods and services is to provide this gender transition for £1 million or whatever, dollars or whatever it is, or however much they cost. Maybe it's not $1 million, maybe it's 100K, maybe it's 20K. It doesn't really matter.
It's about $115,000.
Right. So there's money to be made. The market will provide, right? So I think that's a big part of it. Another part of it is we have the country is smaller, and that means that if you have the right number of people in the right positions who care about this stuff, you actually can make an impact. And having people on, we had a woman called Posey Parker on our show that got 1 million views on this issue, right? Now, 1 million views for Britain is not 1 million views for America. And if a lot of those views came from the UK, that's a hell of a lot of people that have seen that video, right? And that means there are people who care about that issue at the very least. They may not agree, but they care about that issue. And, we've had that a big push from people like Posey Parker and Helen Joyce and J.K. Rowling,
Yeah.
who's obviously made a difference in it all. I mean, Maya, for starter, there's a bit. I'm going to forget someone. It's like giving the thanks at some kind of awards thing. You always forget somebody, but Kathleen Stock. I mean, loads of very, very brave people who came out and spoke out against it, who were sensible, rational, university professors, authors. All sorts of different things, lawyers, etc. Who Alison Bailey is another one, and then I think the Kira Bell case made a big difference, because that was kind of like the first breakthrough, where just people for the first time, I think, in the general public would have seen someone who'd experienced transition that had been attempted to reverse, and people could see the effects and listen to a person who talked in a different way and all that sort of stuff. And they were really confronted by it. So I think there's been a few things along the way. And also, it was the case of the Tavistock, there were whistleblowers. So it's brave people coming forward. We had one of them on the show, Marcus Evans, talking about it. His wife was involved as well. So there are lots of people who actually took concrete steps also to make some kind of impact. And for some reason in America, you guys just, even though I think you're in a better place in terms of your ability to speak, you haven't made as much progress on this issue as I think needs to be made.
Yeah, there's a lot there that's really interesting, actually. Yeah. Like, one element might be America's regionalization, where the more conservative states like South Dakota, even Florida,
right,
where this is essentially illegal, at any rate, Tennessee, aren't too much worried about the issue. And I mean, Florida alone is about a third the size of the UK, without any criticism of the UK. I mean, so that isolationism probably has a lot to do with this. If you live in California, there's not much challenge to these procedures. And if you live in Florida, there's not much support for them. We're kind of, I mean, almost a Brazil style or EU style country, like a gigantic federation of states that are nothing like one another, as you know. For-profit also does come into it. I mean, the figure I gave for top plus bottom surgery, I think if you're American, and as we all probably are by this point, you're in the upper middle class or whatever, we do have one of the world's better medical systems, but if you can pay for it. I mean, right. So that figure, you can take your daughter in there, insurance now has to cover this, and they can, quote unquote, become your son for this price. I mean, yes, of course. They're going to be edgy doctors that are going to specialize in this, that probably come out of the field of plastic surgery or whatever.
Well, as we saw from the Matt Walsh documentary, they might not even be about that. They might just be trans themselves, and they're part of this movement, and they believe this is the right thing for the child, and they're acting in the best interest of the child as they see it. And that could also be true.
Of course. And this is one of those things that's very interesting, because there's an obvious point there that any smart layman would say, but that I think all of us would kind of hesitate to say on the air, right? That if you're trans and you're an activist, you would probably prefer to some extent that there be more trans people. You don't think there's anything wrong with this at all. You're comfortable ethically performing the surgery, so on down the line. So if you have a large number of activist doctors in a profit-seeking system, you're going to get more of this. Just like we have more of everything in the USA. I mean, what is it? We use prescription drugs 8 times as much as the Brits, 10 times as much as the French. I mean, I don't think every young man actually has ADD in the USA, assuming that's a real disease of the mind. But that's a different topic. All right, on Melissa, do you have any comments or questions here?
No, it never occurred to me about the for-profit thing, but that can be empirically looked at. I mean, you can look at all the countries, like even in Scandinavia, that have socialized medicine, so to speak, and look at what they're doing about this kind of gender, how to treat gender dysphoria. It seems like the U.S. is actually probably the most radical when it comes to this kind of solutions that we pursue as a country. It just seems like that is actually supporting that.
Yeah, it's anyway, a really interesting question point. Because I try to tone it down actually for normal interactions, but I'm really into sort of wonky data like this. I would guarantee that relationship probably exists. And it's one of those subsurface things we don't generally think about. Like, why do cops on average shoot black men more than white men? The almost total explanation is social class. Crime plays a role. There's a higher rate of crime there. But we don't think about those drivers you don't look at, you don't see. So things like racism often get blamed, ethnic conflict, political party, the visible, obvious stuff. And it's often deeper than that. And that's something we need to try to realize.
Well, but also we shouldn't forget, Will, if I may add, that there are two dimensions to this. One of them is the incentive structure. Human beings respond to incentives, but also there is ideology too.
Of course, yeah.
Like we can't. Yeah, there's a big chunk of ideology too, and they come well together because you've got well-intentioned people who want to help children, and the people who, as Melissa says, will provide the very latest in technology to help these poor children. That's how some of them would see it, right? And if you were a surgeon or not a surgeon, or a medical company or whatever, that's what you're telling yourself. If you're a CEO of a big pharma company that's providing Lupron or whatever, that's what you're going. Well, we're saving the kids. Otherwise, we've been told.
Yeah, it feels good.
Otherwise, they're going to go and kill themselves. There's a transgenocide going on.
Right.
Yeah. And I also don't think a lot of people don't understand how influential. I mean, and you mentioned this, Konstantin, when you're talking about Britain, the smaller country, so it might be even more intense there. But people don't understand how influential a few activists can be when it comes to these niche topics that most people don't understand. So, I mean, I don't want to mislabel the association. It might be what's called the ACA, one of the childcare associations, one of the medical organizations. But in the USA, it's commonly said, well, even your leading medical organization for kids voted for transgender surgeries, for puberty blockers. If you actually look at the vote, per what I've seen, talking with friends who are doctors or in the medical community, it was like 53 to 37. The organization has something on the order of 60,000 members. That easily could be wrong for anyone watching. But that's how almost all of these go. Like the people that are in some non-methods panel at a big conference that are interested in this topic will come out and vote on it. And so this is very often dominated by sort of either the most radical people interested in this edgy field of surgery or like their reactionary older opponents. That's who makes the call. Like the 60,000 other doctors are there to drink and look for dates and explore the beaches of Hawaii where the conference absolutely had to be had for some reason, and so on down the line, as everyone does at business events. So, I mean, that's how you get every leading medical organization, supporting all of this. That would have been the case for almost anything, lobotomy until 40 years ago, so on. So many people don't understand that. The idea is all the authorities are stacked against me. That could represent maybe 300 people total.
It's the Bolsheviks all over again.
Yeah, it's...
No
well,
way.
One of them, it was actually some Chinese general, sounds kind of harsh, but it was one of Mao's fighters that said, what was it, 2%, 3%? Like a few committed fighting men and women can manipulate a group of almost any size. It was like it takes, and it was very like high IQ. It was very mathematical, but it takes 2.1 people that know what they're doing to control a group of 100. And you can use this to control cities. That's how many troops you need to send in. That almost certainly remains true in intellectual combat, physical, moral, so on down the line. Because most people don't care. Most people want to go home, eat a sandwich, hang out with their partner.
That's a very good point. I wish I could be one of those people, but I can't.
Yeah.
I wish I could just not care and go home and have a sandwich.
Well, it's like the old line. Somebody, maybe it was James Lindsay.
I'll make it for you.
You'll make it.
Sorry.
Boom. Gender roles, all kind of offensive stuff going on in the podcast. But like somebody in like the group recently said,
put a trigger warning at the beginning. Gender roles are discussed in this podcast.
Are enacted.
Anti-feminism. But no, like it's like the old line, whoever the source was in this case, but like it would be very easy just to believe in God and be completely trad. Like, be a husband or trad wife, go to church 2 times a week and just like accept what you're told so you can focus on your job, making art or doing your craft, doing your trade. You don't worry about any of this bullshit at all, excuse the language. Just like, whatever the big guy tells you, the new pope, etc., that is the rule. It's very difficult to not be able to just believe this, whether or not you have a personal spirituality. Is it good? Is it bad? That's for each individual to decide.
No, I think it's a better life. I just wish I could switch the part of my brain off that doesn't let me do that. That's all. But I think that's a great life. If people are doing that, I'm quite jealous, actually.
Well, yeah, I mean, at some level, being able to switch between quote unquote sub, dom, lord, craftsman, man, woman, etc. in your brain at will would be great. It would be a unique ability. I too wish I could do this, but unfortunately, no human can. But human brings us to a fascinating question. So, Konstantin, as we wrap up the podcast, sort of, and this question itself may take a bit, but Angel Eduardo always used to conclude with one final item that I think is a really good one, which is the line, what does being pro-human mean to you? And I think Melissa and I should ask you that. What does being pro-human mean to you in terms of perhaps involvement with FAIR, but also more broadly, just trying to help people, discussing some of these issues, whether that's, helping kids avoid bad choices or just, moving whole blocks in society forward? What does being pro-human mean to you?
Well, this will be an answer that's heavily influenced by the fact that I became a dad 6.5 months ago.
Congrats.
Oh.
But thank you. I think, and I've been thinking about this a lot. I was invited to do a debate at the Oxford Union, which was about, has woke culture gone to, I can't be asked to talk about this again. So when I was talking about it, I really made it about, I said, I don't want to talk to those of you who already agree with me and rehash the same free speech and all this other bullshit that we all know. You already agree with me. You're going to vote for our side of the debate anyway. I want to talk to the woke people. And I was basically talking to them for 10 minutes about how they believe above all, apparently that's what we're being told, that young people have climate anxiety. And they think that the climate issue is the most important issue ever, and it's really important. And I said to them, look, if you think that's important, if you think that's the most important issue, then wokeness is exactly the route by which you'll never solve that issue. Because you guys, the bright young minds of Oxford, those of you who are woke, aren't thinking about how do you go and solve that problem. You're thinking about how the problem's about racism or how you've been oppressed by the previous generations, instead of going and studying and inventing the thing that's going to solve the thing. Right? That's your job. That's what you're supposed to do. Right? Mm-hmm. Instead of whining and crying and complaining, which is what wokeness. And hopefully it was more elaborate than the pathetic way I've just expressed it now. But the point is, I think what we have to get to as a humans, as a species, everywhere in the world, and particularly in the West where we're most affected by it, being pro-human means being pro having children and pro the idea that the planet will endure and human beings and the species will endure. Because why are we so bloody arrogant that we think we're the first generation in history that cannot solve their own fucking problems? When did this happen? When did we decide we're just all going to roll over and die unless we make everyone really poor? When did this happen? Who voted for this? Where did we sign on the dotted line to say, I want to believe that I'm far more pathetic than my grandparents? Why can our generation not solve our problems? Why can't the next generation solve our problems? We've always done this. Every great transformation in human society is a product of technology. It's what it is, right? And technology means going from not having fire to having fire. You don't think that changed human society? You don't think the move from being hunter-gatherers to agrarians changed culture and politics and how people related to each other? This is what happens. We solve our problems with technology, right? I didn't sign up to be, the last generation on Earth that puts the lights out. I believe as a human species, we have the ability to solve our problems. And climate change, if you think it's as serious as it is, go and solve it. Go and solve it. And the more people we have on the planet, the more solutions we have in the bank, potentially, right? So that's being pro-human means to me is, let's stop moping about and let's go. We are the product of generations, of millennia of human beings who managed to survive despite the difficulties we faced.
Oof.
Let's do the same.
Love that answer.
How's that?
Sounds good to me.
Love it. It's perfect. Konstantin Kisin, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, guys. Really enjoyed that.
Thank you for listening to Fair Perspectives. If you'd like to support the show, you can do it by subscribing on YouTube and on your favorite podcast platform and leaving us a positive rating and review. You can also access exclusive podcast content such as Q&As and bonus episodes by visiting us and signing up at fairperspectives.org. For weekly FAIR news and opinion pieces by members of the FAIR community, visit our Substack at fairforall.substack.com and tune into FAIR News Weekly wherever you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to join or support the pro-human movement, visit us at fairforall.org/join us. Thanks again, and see you next time.